welcome, dear researchers and researchers to be. As usual, in this our bi-weekly series of webinar from Research Square by the one and the only, okay, our guest speaker, Gareth Dyke, PhD, and welcome, Gareth.
Hi, Noran. How are you doing today? Everything's good?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Not too bad. Not too bad. I've turned my video on, so hopefully everyone can see me. I can't see myself.
Yes, we are seeing your screen and we are seeing your camera on and everything.
Great stuff. Wonderful.
Is great.
Wonderful. Good. Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. It's great to see so many people. It's great to have the chance to do this. Should we get started, or should we wait for a few minutes for more people to join us in the webinar room?
They are already joining here at the Zoom and on the Facebook Live. Yeah, please, everyone, while entering, although I have adjusted this to keep the webinar smooth, okay, please, everyone, mute your microphones, write your questions and comments at the chat box if you are attending through Zoom, or the comments via Facebook.
Absolutely.
And also, please don't forget to fill in the certificate form. It is a totally different form than the registration form, because Mars and Research Square offer this certificate for the live attendance only. So please fill in the certificate form that the link will be published here at the Zoom chat box or the Facebook comments. Welcome everyone, and we are starting. Let's start now, guys.
Okay, great. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for the chance to do this, and welcome everyone. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to our series. If you're not here for the first time, welcome back to this series of Research Square Mars Training Network webinars. And today we're going to talk about what open research means for you. So we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But if you've not met me before, my name is Gareth. I used to work in the UK. I used to work in the US, Ireland, and Hungary, publishing papers, writing papers, dealing with journal editors, and working myself as a journal editor for a journal published by Taylor and Francis. So I work now with the Research Square Company, which is actually part of a larger organization, Springer Nature. We are part of the Springer Nature group. So our brands, American Journal Experts, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and Research Square, the preprint server, very important part of the open research ecosystem, which is of course the topic of our webinar today. But we've been helping researchers around the world for a long time. We've been helping researchers all over the world with their writing and with their publishing. So it's important as we get started, and I'm going to turn my camera off because I have a little bit of a cold, unfortunately, today. So I'm going to be coughing and spluttering. Turn my camera back on at the end for the Q&A session. We invite you listening to this presentation to jump on over at this point to our website, resources.aje.com/digital-editing-web. I've put the link there in the chat box. You'll be able to get access. You'll be able to get a trial of our amazing digital editing tool, which is something that you can have a go at using. It's a great way to edit your papers. You can upload a document in English into this editing tool, sit back, drink a tea, drink a coffee, come back 10 minutes later, and you'll be able to get your document downloaded from the site, edited in English. So that's probably worth having a look at. I'll leave that up there throughout the presentation today. But of course, our mission at Research Square, working with the Mars Training Network, working with Noran and colleagues, is to make research communication faster, fairer, and more usable. So we're a team of scientists, researchers, language experts, and publishing industry professionals working together to find new ways to help researchers succeed. Here's a few of the publishers that we work with. So have a look at some of the publishers, potentially some of the opportunities for getting your work published in some of these journals. If you'd like more information about this, if you'd like more information about the work that we do with Mars, get in touch with Naran. We'll be able to help you to steer your research effectively into one of these journals published by one of these publishing companies, because we have close relationships with all of these publishers and more. What are we talking about today? You're probably thinking, why should I listen to this presentation today? Well, we're going to be talking about open access. We're going to be talking about open research. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you have something that you'd like to ask or something that you'd like to get clarified, don't forget to put it into the chat box. We'll have time for questions at the end of our presentation today. It's also important that everybody will get a copy of the slides from this presentation. Everybody will also get a recording of this presentation. You can listen back as many times as you like. So we're going to discuss this afternoon, this evening, open access, open research, give you a little bit of history around that. We're going to talk about some industry trends and some resources. And then we're going to talk about understanding open access publishing and a few things to know about when you go in and when you start to think about selecting a target journal. Because when most people think about open research or open access, that equates for most people to the issue of journal selection, to the issue of journal choice. Of course, when people say, hey, like, what do you think about open access? You're most often going to be thinking about journals. The point of all of this training, of course, the point of these webinars, the point of these presentations is to help everybody enhance their careers and, of course, achieve your potential as a researcher. Well, of course, now open access, as you can see here on this diagram, open access publishing everything open so that anybody can get access to the work that you put out, is in fact just one component of a much larger ecosystem, one component of a much larger group of projects that we like to call open research. So there you can see open access publishing, but there are lots of other ways in which you can put your work and contribute to being open with your research and with your activities as a researcher, as you can see here on this slide. Open access, open data, open reproducible research, open science policy, open science tools, all ways in which the research and the data collection and the publications and the outputs that we produce as researchers are available, transparent, and accessible to everybody. And this is different, as you'll see a little bit later in this presentation, to the traditional model for academic publishing, whereby you put your work into a journal, you upload your data onto a journal website, it gets peer reviewed, of course, and then it gets published, but only those people who buy access, have subscription access, or their institutions have subscription access, are able to get to see the work. And of course, that's not what most researchers want. By and large, we tend to want to participate in open research, to participate in open science. If you've got comments on that, please put them into the chat box. We'll come back and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I can see colleagues are writing where they're from and saying hello to us in the chat box. We do encourage that. Hello, everybody from me. Hello, Dr. Hassan from Somalia. Hello, Naran. Hello, everybody. Hello, Nazreen. Good evening, everybody. We're talking about open access. We're talking about open research. Now, open access literature is digital, online, free of charge, and free of most copyright and most licensing restrictions. What is not to like? The initial benchmark in this area is the Budapest Open Access Initiative. This is where this was first kind of codified, first put down. By open access to literature, we mean free availability on the public internet, permitting anyone to read, download, copy, distribute, print, search, or link to the full text of articles. So that's quite simple. And I think that most of us, if not all of us, would agree that what we want to see with our research, with our data, with our publications is accessibility. We want assessment. We want our work to be peer reviewed. Of course, we want to publish in decent outlets, but we do want our work to be open access. We do want our research to be digital, online, and free of charge, free of many licensing restrictions. Perhaps you disagree. That would be very interesting to hear about if you'd like to put comments to that effect in the chat box. But generally speaking, most researchers around the world are in favor of open research. They're in favor of open access. And so open access literature, it's digital, online, free of charge, and free of most copyright and licensing restrictions. But if you put your work into an open access journal, if you put your work onto a preprint server, if you show your work to everybody, even if it's peer reviewed, you're still protected. And that's very important because work is covered by copyright law, even if the work is published in an open access journal. The open access terms, we'll talk about what that means in a minute, apply to allowing sharing and reuse. Now, if you publish a paper in a traditional journal that protects the work behind a paywall, you may not end up having the copyright yourself as a researcher. You may have transferred that copyright to the publisher. And that's another big difference between open access publishing, where you retain the copyright, and the more traditional model of publishing where the publisher will take the copyright. So that's another important distinction. We'll come back to that in a minute. All major open access initiatives, however, if you publish your work in an open access journal, it's still going to get peer reviewed. We're not talking about moving away at all from a model of peer review in the scholarly literature, in the research literature. We still use, and I hope that we will always use, some form of peer review as a benchmark for the quality of literature, for the quality of papers that appear in any forum. And that's what is the basis for reusing work in our own research. So open access or not, peer review is nevertheless the basis for all of this. So this is a background. What is open access? Well, when people say, what's open access to you? If you're anything like me, you probably think about publishing, open access publishing, but let's just be aware that this is one component, one part of a much larger movement, the open research movement. And you can skip back when you're listening to this later, back to the slide that I showed you a little bit earlier. There's lots and lots and lots of different ways in which you as a researcher can make your content, your data, your ideas, your writing available to others free of charge. And of course, free of copyright and licensing restrictions as well. When this movement first got going, it was a big shock to the traditional publishing industry. Of course it was, because most of their business model, at least at that time, was based upon institutions and individuals paying a subscription to access online content. So we are now at the point, if you look at organizations like COPE, publicationethics.org, one of the biggest industry players, one of the benchmarks for a lot of this content, keeps us all in line, keeps us all on the straight and narrow. Copyright, peer review, revenue, very important for publishers, print preservation, prestige, quality, career advancement, indexing, and a number of other features are all consistent with open access publishing. So, as you'll be aware, of course, lots of publishers now provide very high quality open access journals, places where you can choose to put your research out into the public domain after peer review in an open access way. And that's important too. We'll come back to it a little bit later because, of course, the costs associated with peer reviewed publication can be an issue for lots of researchers. if not most of the researchers, most researchers around the world. But at this point, we're talking about definitions. And how did this happen? How did open access as a movement in publishing come about? Well, here you're looking at a graph that just shows percentage change in price for access to journal content over the years between 1990 and 2010. And you can see that generally speaking, publishers, so the big publishers, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Wiley and Springer Nature, those are the big four academic publishers. There are many others, but those four have the bulk of the academic publishing market, paying for their content as a library, as an institution on a subscription basis, got a lot more expensive over that 10-year period, as you can see on these graphs. So libraries, institutions, and researchers started to think, isn't there a better way for us to share our research? Why does it have to cost so much for our institution to get access to content? So this is called the crisis in scholarly publishing, the crisis in scholarly communication. We saw flat to declining, we still see that, budgets at libraries, at institutions, at the government level, more demand for newer and more expensive resources and databases, and most importantly, a greatly increased price, as you saw on the previous slide, for electronic content. So this, of course, combined with the rise of online content and online communication tools, led to the better dissemination of new research online, and of course also better connectivity between scholars. So of course, if you're of my age, many of you are much younger, I know, listening to this, but I remember a time when I'd go to the university library every week, toddle along into the library and read the journals that had been delivered to the library that week. And I'd flick through them and I'd look for papers relevant to my research. We're in a very different situation now, of course. Now we are looking at much of the content that we have available to us being online and much of it being open access. So here you can see some historical dates, and we're looking, around the time that these digital libraries were launched, digital initiatives, network digital libraries of theses and dissertations, and so on. And really from the 1990s onwards, lots and lots of content became available online. PubMed Central was launched in 2002. Digital Creative Commons licenses were released around that time as well. The Directory of Open Access Journals was launched. And then we see a number of declarations across the publishing industry mandating or moving towards open access publishing. Most important of these, the Budapest Open Access Initiative that we've already talked about. Publishers and universities and library consortia declared their intention towards moving to a lot more content published online and a lot more content published open access. And this slide just summarizes some more important dates going up to and including around 2009. Lots of universities now, and if not the bulk of scholarly content, is in some form or another available online and open access. Here's that Budapest Open Access Initiative inviting governments, universities, libraries, journal editors, publishers, foundations, and so on to share our vision in the task of removing barriers to open access and building a future in which research and education in every part of the world are much freer to flourish. So going back to the title of this event, what does open research mean for you? If you're listening to this and you're asking yourself that question, what does open research mean for you? For me, it means access to the research and the data of others. And it also means that my research, my information, the data that I collect should be freely available and downloadable and accessible to anybody around the world, irrespective of their country or institutional budget. And that, I think, is very important. You have some other important statements here: the Bethesda Statement, the Berlin Declaration on 2015, the Berlin Declaration on Open Access from 2003, and then perhaps the most famous movement in this area so far, of course, Plan S or Coalition S, a big European Union movement. It didn't quite work out as everybody had expected, as everybody had wanted, but a big European Union movement towards making open access for everybody a reality by 2020. We're now sitting here making presentations like this in 2022. Has it happened? No. Most of the reason for the fact that it hasn't happened has been cost and budgets and pushback from the major publishers. But this was a movement within the European Union to mandate that any research funded by the European Union must be published in an open access journal. That's great. That sounds fantastic. But I hear you screaming at your computer screens as you listen to this. Who is going to pay those horrendous open access article processing charges? And of course, that's something that we'll come back to in a moment. Of course, that's something else that I'm sure many people listening to this will have comments and questions about. So open access to research, just to summarize, means that content is universally available online without any barriers to access. It's licensed, so anyone can redistribute it and reuse it as long as you cite and give the attribution of the source. So what that means in practical terms is if I publish a paper and it's got figures or data in it, if I publish that information in a traditional journal where the publisher is going to make money from subscriptions to that content, then I won't own the copyright. If Naran or somebody else wants to reuse figures from that paper in one of their subsequent pieces of work, they've got to go and ask the publisher. They've got to go and ask Springer Nature or Elsevier or Wiley or Taylor and Francis, can I reuse a figure from Gareth's paper in one of my subsequent articles? One of the big moves in the open research movement is if you publish your work open access, you own the copyright, not the publisher. And so anyone else can reuse that content, but they've got to attribute it to you. Of course they have. They've got to cite you. They've got to show the source. And I think that's much fairer, much more open, and much more effective as a method for information sharing within the global research community. And the other thing that's important, of course, is that everything gets permanently archived in an internationally recognized repository like Research Square, the preprint server, or PubMed Central, another resource that I'm sure you've heard about. So we ask ourselves, and this leads on to a wider discussion of open research and why it's such a good thing for us as researchers. Of course, in the traditional model, in the current system, or the traditional model for publishing, intellectual effort that goes into a research article comes from the research community, authors, peer reviewers, academic editors, and people often ask, why should a published article be under the absolute control of a publisher? Why should a published article be under the absolute control of a publisher who actually plays a limited role at the end of the process? Of course, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that subscription-based access to research is the legacy of print-based economics. It makes no sense in an online environment. And we've seen this in a library context. As those prices for content have increased, journal costs have increased, library budgets have not kept up with rises in journal subscriptions. And what you see is that publishers were creating big deals, bundling journals together, offering access to more content without much flexibility to choose or cancel individual titles. So the overall consequence of this was that libraries started to be selective in their purchasing, and there was an inability to offer access to anything like the totality of scholarly output. So unless you were based at a big institution with lots of cash, lucky enough to be at Harvard or Oxford or, I don't know, the American Museum of Natural History, you would not have had access to all of the content being published in your subject area. And so, of course, open access rose up. Under the traditional model, publishing and research community. The research community gives up control of the research and the publisher sells it back. Under an open access publishing model, the publisher charges directly for the service of publication and or dissemination. And that's the dreaded article processing charge. Role of funders in open research. Well, more and more funding agencies have policies, as you may know, requiring funding recipients to deposit articles in an open access archive. And in the UK, we have the Wellcome Trust, who took the lead on this, followed by the majority of biomedical UK funders, such as the UK branch of PubMed Central. European funders and global funders and research organizations all have similar policies. If you get money from us, they say, we want you to publish your research in a journal that's open access. And that was the whole point of Plan S. Did it work out? Well, it didn't work out all that great. We're still stuck in a kind of limbo situation between these two major models for publishing. And I just put in this slide to give you a little bit more information about Plan S and what it means. You should be publishing in open access journals or on open access platforms. You should be depositing your research in repositories without embargoes. And if you're going to publish an article in a subscription journal, then that journal's got to be also offering an open access option. We'll talk a little bit about what those mean in a minute, but that was the idea. And I'm sure that you've heard about this. I'm sure that perhaps in your countries as well, there's similar ideas. We want to be able to access as much content as possible. Well, of course, what does that mean for us as researchers? What does that actually mean in terms of journal selection then, and how open access actually happens? It happens in one of two ways. It happens by submitting an article to a traditional publisher and then putting a draft of that article, an earlier draft, onto a repository like a preprint server or onto your institutional website. An open access repository, that's called green open access publishing. Or we submit a paper, one of our papers, to a fully open access journal. That's called gold open access. So fundamentally, we have two different ways to publish our work open access. We go to a traditional journal, put the paper into a traditional journal, but they also allow us to preprint, or they allow us to put the work up onto our institutional website. So that would be a green model. Lots of journals are in the middle. They're doing that. They're allowing green open access submissions. Or we go to a fully open access journal like Frontiers or PLOS ONE, or one of the Nature family of journals, Nature Communications, Scientific Reports, something like that, where the article in its entirety is open access. So that's also important. And many commercial publishers, as you'll be aware, are offering an option to pay to make an individual article open access, a so-called hybrid model. So, for example, if you submit a paper to Nature and it's lucky enough to get accepted, that article will not be available to everybody. It's going to be behind a paywall. It's going to be only available to the people, the institutions that paid a subscription to get access to that content. We've all experienced it. We've all tried to download a paper and had that annoying little box come up and say, pay us $60 or pay us $200 to get access to this article. If your institution's not subscribing, you won't be able to download any old paper published in Nature unless the authors, their funding agency most likely, because very few authors have the cash to just pay for their article to become a hybrid paper, to pay for their article to become open access. You'd be shocked if you heard what some of the charges are that some of the big publishers are levying to make sure that articles do become open access. Here's a summary of it. Journal selection and routes towards open access. Gold is the simplest. You just submit a paper to a journal that has a fully open access series. Public Library of Science, PLOS, Frontiers, Nature Communications, Scientific Reports, That's the fully open access, the gold open access journals, but you're going to have to pay for that. You're going to have to pay an article processing charge, or submit to a traditional journal and deposit your article at the same time in an open access repository in a draft form. That's how PubMed Central works. That's how arXiv, preprint servers like that, bioRxiv, ResearchSquare, that's how those sites work. So it's important to be aware of this, how you can, as a researcher, participate in open access if you don't have the cash to pay the article processing charges. There are other ways that you can do it. And we've talked in this series before about journal selection. Of course, we recommend that you aim high. We recommend that you try to get the most out of your publishing, the most out of your fantastic research. So you want to go to journals with higher impact factors, but often open access journals are younger. They haven't been around for so long, so they don't have such high impact factors. And that's what I mean when I say choose appropriately. If you want to listen back to some of our other training presentations, like how to communicate with editors and peer reviewers, how to talk to peer reviewers, how to write effectively in English, you'll find all of those recordings on the Mars Research Hub website. And I'm sure that Naram will provide you all with the link to that. But selecting a journal is very important. As an initial step, we of course are talking about open access journals where you've got a model of content free to end users, generally online only, of course, then, but peer review is carried out in the same way as in traditional journals. But there's this growing move towards an author pays model. We all hate it. APCs, article processing charges predicated on funds, often being available from universities or from funders. So these are places to go. These are places you can learn more about by looking, for example, at the directory of open access journals. And we do have lots of other courses as well, lots of other content on how to avoid predatory open access journals. Again, have a look at the Mars Research Hub if you want to get more information about how to avoid predatory publishers. Publishers have moved to offering free open access for individual articles on payment of a fee. Where does that money come from? That's something that we also need to talk about. Your work is, of course, protected by Creative Commons licensing. It's the open access alternative to all rights reserved. There's no reason to worry about publishing your work in an open access journal, because as I've already mentioned, if you do that, you own the copyright, not the journal. There are several different kinds of licenses. This slide and the next one summarize what they mean, but people who want to use your figures or use your data or use your research will be able to by just citing the source. They won't have to go back to the publisher and ask for permission. Again, if you'd like more information about what these different kinds of attributions actually mean, I'd be very happy to talk with any of you one-on-one, talk about where you could go with your next article, talk about what open research means for you. But of course, as we've seen before, authors want speed. They want high reach and readership, and they also want a decent impact factor. Not always possible with open access journals, but you should be looking at the journals that you are selecting for your research. Does the journal have an impact factor, and what does that mean? Is the journal peer reviewed? Who's on the editorial board? Where's the impact factor? What's the reputation? Does the journal have a decent reach within your field? And I think very importantly for lots of researchers, is the journal open access? So here's my pirate code. You've seen it already on a slide before. Aiming high, talking to editors, and learning to sell and manage your article submission. Very important series of things that you can have a think about as a researcher. So when selecting a journal, thinking about, am I going to send my next paper to an open access journal? What are the aims and scopes? Have you checked the author guidelines? Do you have a clear handle on the writing style, the relevant references? And is your work original, important, and is your work useful? Here's a checklist. Maybe you've seen it before, maybe you've not seen it before, maybe you'd like to take a screenshot. Is your work novel, original? What's the real-world significance and importance of your study? How soon can your findings be applied? What's the potential for changing international practice and policy, thinking in the field, thinking in other fields? And are your implications both short and long term? Because answers to these questions can determine which journal you're going to be able to get your work published in. And so, irrespective of open access, although that's often very, very, very important to lots of researchers, have a think when selecting a journal, which factor is most important to you. The aims and scope, the readership, what kind of article can you write, the evidence level, the publication speed, the frequency, the indexing, the rank, the impact factor. Will the journal be print only or will it be online? Will it be open access? And what's the acceptance rate? And I would say that all authors, everybody listening to this, has their own unique combination of factors that are most important to them when selecting a journal. Of course, your journal should have an impact factor. Very important. If you're submitting articles to journals that don't have impact factors, I would say you might want to think again. If you've got research that's publishable, have a look for journals that have impact factors. That's critically important to maximize your career potential. Where the impact factors come from, they get released every year by the analytics company Clarivate Analytics. So if you're looking at a journal for your next paper and it says that it has an impact factor, go in and have a look and make sure that that really is an impact factor from Clarivate Analytics. In summary of what we've been talking about in terms of open access journals, you've got your traditional publishers and you've got your open access publishers. Open access publishers are broken down into traditional journals that allow you to put your work onto a repository at the time of publication. They are called green open access journals, and the fully open access ones, your journals that provide you with full gold open access. So have a think about that. That's also very important. So you might be able to self-archive an accepted version on a personal site, on a university site, or in a repository, and there may be an embargo period before self-archiving is allowed, or your journal may be fully gold, free for the public on publication. The author retains the copyright, but there may be a publication fee. And this also summarizes what I've been talking about this afternoon, this evening. Open access. If you've got questions about whether your target journal is good or not, we do recommend that you have a look at the COPE website, publicationethics.org. Have a look at the DOAJ.org, the Directory of Open Access Journals. Here you will find a searchable database where you can look for journals open access in your field, and then you can search them by cost. You can search them by impact factor. You can go in and find a suitable place for your paper, because of course many open access journals are not good. There's an easy way to cheat people. People are paying money to get their papers published. This has led to a predatory publishing business model, a quick promise, and easy publication. We've talked about this before. Open access publishing fee at submission. You can check spammers at scientificspam.net. And we also recommend this fantastic resource, thinkchecksubmit.org. Think, is your journal, the journal that you're looking at for your paper, trusted and appropriate? Check. Do you know the journal? Do you know the publisher? Is there a clear peer review policy and a fee structure? Is the journal listed on COPE, DOAJ, and so on? And then submit only if you're happy. If you'd like to talk to us, we can also help with this process. thinkchecksubmit.org. Is the publisher reputable? Who's on the editorial board? Is the journal indexed? Do you recognize other authors? And is the fee structure for publication clearly stated on the website? You should never, ever, ever be paying for publication until your article is accepted. So, in summary, and thank you so much for listening to this webinar this afternoon, this evening, what is open access? We've talked about some history, recent industry trends, and some resources, and then understanding open access or not, things to know when selecting a journal. And absolutely, we'll send you a recording of this lecture. We'll send you the slides of this lecture. We are here, Research Square Company and the Mars Research Hub, to help you enhance your career and achieve your potential. Just before Naran jumps back in, I want to say quickly, if you've never seen Research Square Print Server, do have a look at it, researchsquare.com. It's pre-processor in the world, huge opportunity for you to get your work out there, open access, share your research with the wider academic community, really well worth doing. As I mentioned already at the start of this presentation, we do have an absolutely fantastic digital editing. Have a look at the box. You can upload a paper. You can go away and walk around the garden or drink a cup of tea and come back and the paper will be edited. High quality technical editing in less than 10 minutes. The link that I've just posted, and I'm going to post it again now, will give you access to a free trial of that AJE digital editing tool. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gareth Dyke. Here's a discount code for all of our AJE services. There's that link again. You can see that there. You can take a screenshot of this slide. You can get in touch with me on WhatsApp, on Telegram. You can email me at garethdyke@researchsquare.com. Have a look at AJE for our other professional services. Naran, how are you doing? And thank you everybody for listening to this presentation today. Thank you so much.